Why is that a particularly helpful thing? Why is it that we would want to know what the target is and what the current target is? Well, the biggest, I guess, issue or problem that we can encounter when dealing with dynamic pages, maybe such as a page that has a report on it, is that sometimes an event might, or an element might be constantly created or destroyed. And I want to show you something. And so let's go ahead and we're actually going to wire something up together. So I have a little bit of extra time to do this because I wanted to do this with you. Let's go ahead and I'm actually going to make a new page. And I don't care if I'm losing some changes here. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a classic report on employees. And I'll create a new navigation entry so I can come back here and see this. I'm going to need to select my my data source, and I'll go ahead and pick the emp table. And I'll say create. That's okay, I'll just leave those changes. And when I run my page, you can see I have my report and all as well, but what I would really like to be able to do is I would love to be able to interact with one of these employee records. And there's several different ways that you could do that. I could make a link that opens a modal dialog. I could make an edit link that goes to a new page. But sometimes there are actions that warrant just a button in this report. And maybe you want, we'll kind of make a fun button here. We'll say we want to give issue raises. So how in the world are we going to do that? Well, first, we need to provide a button for the user to actually click on to give the raise. So let's go ahead and make that happen. And when I do this, there's a couple different ways that you could do this. And for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a virtual column. And when I create a virtual column, oftentimes you're making a link that's going to go somewhere or do something. But I'm going to say that this virtual column is actually just plain text. And I should get a little HTML expression for how I want this column to look. And I want this column to look like a nice Apex button. And there's a fairly easy way for me to do that. I mean, I guess I could go inspect the HTML of a different button and copy that. Or I could go to apex.oracle.com/UT. Underneath the reference in the bottom right hand corner, there's a utility here called Button Builder, which I think is very helpful. And there's the button that's currently being previewed. And I can configure what this button's going to look like. So let's just go kind of quickly with this, and I'll say give raise. I think dollar is a thing. Perfect. And I like when I have buttons in reports, I'll actually make them a little bit smaller, just so that they don't make each row too large. But that just depends on your preference. And the other thing I'm gonna do is I'll make this, a success button, just so it kind of really stands out. Cool. So that actually might be a little bit too noisy. Let's go ahead and make it a simple button. Maybe that's what I want, right? In terms of style, you can pick whatever you want. But the cool part here is that it's going to give me the entire markup for this button. So I can actually go ahead and copy that markup, and I can paste it here, and I'll say save and run. And now I have this little button, give raise, that I can click on, but notice that nothing actually happens. So how do I actually wire this up, and what exactly do I need to do? Well, what needs to happen is that I need to listen to the click event of this button. I need to know the employee number in which I want to give a raise, and I just have a static amount that I'm going to provide. We'll say a raise is always going to be $100. And then when I'm done with all of that, I need to refresh this report. So I could write some vanilla JavaScript to do that. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use a dynamic action that uses several of the topics that we already covered. So let's go ahead and make this happen. So the first thing is, remember I said you need 3 ingredients, right? You need to know what you want to listen to, or what element you want to listen to, and what the event is. Well, I know I want to listen to these buttons, and I know I want to listen to click. So how do I allow myself to identify all of these different buttons and nothing else? Well, the cool part is I have this HTML markup that I can manipulate. And here's a little strategy that I like to use to be able to identify these types of buttons. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create my own class and associate it with this button. But I am going to do something a little bit special in that I'm going to prefix this class with JS. And the reason why I'm prefixing it with JS, technically it means absolutely nothing. But what I'm trying to convey to other developers is that please do not write any CSS styling or anything against this class. I'm strictly using this class as a means to for my JavaScript to be able to target an element. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to call this raise button, or we call it button raise, or whatever you want to call it. It's up to you. But I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And I'm also going to go ahead and say that I need a little piece of information on this button to know which element I'm going, or which employee I'm going to give the raise to. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to create my own attribute. And you can totally create any attribute that you think is will be useful for you. All you have to do is begin with data dash. And now that I say data dash, I can put anything I want after that. And it's my own piece of information to use potentially in my events. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say, well, I really need the employee number. So I'm going to say data dash empno. And just to be clear, the HTML standard has no idea what data empno is, nor does it care. It just knows that, well, apparently it matters to me. So it's going to make sure that it has this value for me to use later. Well, the cool part about using this HTML expression is that I can bind into it any one of these columns, and I just so happen to have empno. So I'm going to go ahead and say empno. And so now, not only do I know which button to click, I also know which employee is associated with that button. Cool. Save that. Well, how do I make a dynamic action that's going to listen to the click of this button? Well, let me make sure that I have it copied. And we're going to head on over to dynamic actions. And it looks like there's the event that we're interested in. Click, right click, and create dynamic action. And as always, when creating dynamic actions, it's always a good practice to name your dynamic actions based on kind of what's being selected and what the event is, not necessarily what's going to happen when it's clicked. So what I mean by that is I should call this, give raise button clicked. That's it. I'm not saying actually give a raise. I'm just saying when that button is clicked. The selection type now requires that I clarify what element or elements that I'm interested in. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say jQuery selector, and I'm going to put a little period in front here that denotes that I'm looking for the class JS raise button. Well, now I need my third ingredient, which is what's going to happen or what should happen when I click this button. Well, at the moment, it kind of defaults to show, and I don't want that. But what I'll go ahead and do is just to make this visible, I'll add an alert and I'll say button clicked. Save and run. Well, when I click on this button here, I get my button clicked and everything's working as I expected. Well, let me kind of skip ahead a little bit, and I'm going to pretend that the update happened. Like I'm going to pretend that I wrote the PL SQL to actually update the salary and all that good stuff. And then when I'm done with that, I need to refresh my report. So let's go ahead and add that refresh logic. I'm going to create a new action, and I'm going to say, let's go ahead and refresh the region report 1. Now watch what happens. So I'm going to click this first button. Okay, cool. That's what we were expecting. Okay. And then the report actually refreshed. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to click this button. And my alert doesn't function anymore. Wait a minute. So this is actually kind of interesting. So one thing that we could do is if we go to our inspector and let me refresh my page. Inspect element here. There we can see my event. And I can see that there is a click event that has been registered to this button. Now, if I click it, and let's go ahead and inspect this element again, you can see there is no click event associated with this button anymore. And the reason for that is because this is not the same button. And in fact, the easiest way to visualize this is if I open up the network tab, close this and reload. When I click give raise, you can see that an AJAX request is sent to the server to get new data for this report. And if I look at the response, you can actually see that my new set of give raise buttons is sent back and injected into the page. So this is, even though it looks like the same button, it is not the same button. So how do we deal with this problem? Well, we already have the solution, and that is we can exploit the event bubbling that we just talked about, and we can delegate the handling of this event to somewhere else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, you know what? Under the advanced section of my dynamic action, it has an event scope. And all we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and say that we want this to be dynamic. And if you choose not to put a selector here, then this event handler is going to be registered to the document, which is kind of way up at the root. It's something that is not going to be destroyed and recreated. But it will make sure that it's going to be waiting for click events, but it's only going to respond if the click event comes from something that matches this query, this selector here. So let's see what happens. So now I can say give raise, and it says button clicked. It refreshes. I say give raise. It says button clicked. Give raise. It says button clicked, right? So it doesn't matter how many times this refreshes. Since I've delegated that event somewhere else using a dynamic action, then we were able to solve some of those tricky problems. So again, if you use event delegation when the element might be recreated, or if you just have several elements that share the exact same handler, which I think both of these were true in that situation. The other problem that you can run into is that sometimes you have events that are extremely noisy. In other words, they fire very often and maybe too often, and you want to have some way to kind of dampen or suppress the amount of times that you handle that event. A couple things that really come to mind are when you're listening to like key up events as a user is typing and entering things into an input. And the user knows what word they're going to type, and so they actually, they're ready to type the whole word Smith, and they type it very quickly. And but your event handlers by default look at that and they say, oh well, S needs it to be handled, M needs to be handled, I, T, H, right? So rather than just handling it one time after Smith was entered, it handles it for every single key. And remember that we're talking to the or we might be trying to talk to the server to fetch more data, and so we're just machine gunning requests at the server uh, at a rate that, if it's just one user, that's really not a problem. But if we have hundreds of users trying to kind of communicate with the server at the same time, and they're all spamming all these requests as they type, well, okay, now we're looking at a problem. So debouncing is the solution for that. And basically what that means is what debouncing does is it essentially just sets a little timer, and it notices that the event has occurred, and then it waits. And it waits for amount of time that you can specify. Normally, you'd specify maybe a couple hundred milliseconds or something fairly small, and it waits. And if the event happens again within that threshold, well, then it resets the timer and then it waits again. And if the event happens again, it resets the timer and it waits again. So potentially the event could happen hundreds of times, thousands of times. But if it happens quickly enough, then in quick succession, because the user is actively typing, well, then it's not going to actually talk to your server, and your user could have entered hundreds or thousands of characters at this point. What does that look like, and when is this useful? So this is useful when most common use case for this is when you have a region that you are refreshing based on user search as the user is typing. So this is normally if you're listening to the key up event. And I do want to point out in this scenario, it is important to listen to the key up event and not the key down event. Because when you listen to the key down event, well, let me show you why this is important. Go ahead and edit my page. And let's look at my code here for a second. Okay. So here I'm just kind of writing, pretty much mostly vanilla JavaScript here. I'm creating my little search item, so I'm going through my documents and I'm looking for my search item. I've defined a function here called handle search, and essentially all it is doing is it's telling my employee report that it needs to refresh. In order for my employee report to refresh, it's going to go send some values up to the server, execute a query, get a result set, build a report, and send that back and kind of refresh, kind of inject some new HTML into where my report was. And I'm going to say that I want to do that every time the key comes up. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and let me Alt-Shift down to clone this line. And I'm going to get rid of debounce. And I'm going to let this happen every single time I press a key. And I'm also going to change this to be a key down. So right as my key goes down. And we're going to observe that there's almost like this weird lag in how my search is represented back on the screen. Let me show you. Oh, maybe I have a syntax error. Ooh, let's fix that. Oh yeah, whoa, try that. There we go. Okay, so now that I have that, I'm gonna look for Smith. So I'll type S, and nothing's, there we go. So now it took me a second character before it would find something, and I'll say I, T, and then I can see that, I am getting Smith, but as I delete these characters, it's actually, what's interesting about this is it's sometimes it can be a little bit of a delay in that it's not really showing me exactly what I typed. And let me go ahead and delete one more time, and then now it's finally showing me nothing. That's bizarre. Well, one thing just to remember is that when you use the key down event, the actual input hasn't really been registered yet. The value of what the key of what the user has entered isn't available. So we actually want to use the key up event. So let me go ahead and change this to key up. Save and run. So now, right as I type the value, it should update. And as I press keys, it matches exactly as what I entered. So that's one little tip there. Key up is extremely helpful. But also notice that when I come over to my network tab, I'm going to look for Smith. And look what happened. S-M-I-T-H. All of these, every time I press a character, it's going to search. And I typed that pretty quickly. So imagine if I know, like, yeah. So I type something out. Look at what I just spammed at the server. Okay, so maybe that's not a good idea. So we're going to go ahead and turn on our debounce. And right now I have my debounce configured to be 1 second. It's heavily exaggerated. Let me clear out my network inspector, and I'm going to type Smith. And it waits, and then finally it refreshes. Now, notice that it was a little bit of there was a noticeable delay in when my report was actually refreshed. The query was incredibly quick, and returning that value was incredibly quick. But it felt, as a user, it's going to feel kind of slow. So you have to hit this right balance of, well, I want to provide enough of a delay that I don't spam my server, but obviously I don't want to make the delay so large that it creates a perceived lag or degradation in performance for my user. And you have to kind of find what that right number is. In the Apex example, they use 100. So we'll go ahead and use 100, and maybe this works for us, maybe it doesn't, but you can always adjust that number to be whatever works for you. So now as I type Smith, that actually still did like 4 requests. And so maybe 100 isn't quite enough. So let's go ahead and let's make this like, I don't know, 300. One request. Okay, so Maybe that's enough. I don't know. It's up to you to decide what is right and what is wrong. And I just, to make this abundantly clear, we are using an API here called Apex Util Debounce. We're providing it a function that we want to execute, and we're providing how long we want to wait, or the delay, before we execute this function. So I had talked a lot about events, and I did end up using a dynamic action at one point to show you something. And I think that when you're just getting started with dealing with events and you're learning how they interact with the page, it can be extremely helpful to use dynamic actions just to kind of get an understanding of how the event system works. I want to wait for this to happen, and then I want to do that. But sometimes, as a page grows in complexity, and sometimes you have tens, hundreds of dynamic actions on a page, managing that, the cognitive load, at least for me personally, it's incredibly tedious, and it can become actually a little bit difficult. So my general rule of thumb is I start with dynamic actions, and I'll use dynamic actions to build out what I need. And then as more demand is put on me as a developer, or more capabilities need to be added to a particular page, well, then if I end up with a dynamic action soup, then I'll end up actually taking a moment, and I will write out a JavaScript file for that page that registers the event listeners, and I normalize it as much as I can, and then I'm going to start managing the page that way. So the takeaway should be, I do not believe that there is a single correct solution for any given page. As a developer, it's our job to evaluate, should I just be making dynamic actions for this? Or, hey, have I made so many or too many dynamic actions on this page now that it's actually kind of hard to manage what's going on? And I would say the situation that can be kind of hard to manage is when especially when you have a dynamic action that's dependent on a dynamic action that's dependent on a dynamic action that's dependent on a dynamic action, and trying to be able to look to trace that code around can be kind of difficult navigating through the user interface, whereas it might not be quite as difficult to connect those dots when you're just looking at the JavaScript code itself. So of course, evaluate your situation and see what's right for you.